Hello and welcome to Free Your Mind with Dr. Sheena Mason. This is part 2 to my question and answer series where I'm sharing Q&A sessions after workshops I delivered in October 2021 to my most asked questions. Those questions inevitably come up during my workshops and presentations. If you are new to the channel, please like, comment, and subscribe so more people can get access to this. And if you've been rolling with me for a while now and this isn't your first time here, welcome back. Go ahead, let me know what questions you have remaining after this series in the comments. Join my patrons to receive access to more Q&As, and happy New Year. Oh yeah, sure. So skepticism So skepticism means that if you are what's called a racial skeptic, you argue that race is not of nature, it's not biological, and it's not a social construction. Now, as a skeptic, before I recognized I was a skeptic, I didn't I knew the definition as I just stated it, but I didn't really know what that meant until something clicked in my brain and then I realized, "Oh, I'm a skeptic, I'm not a constructionist anymore." So once I was on the other side, I feel like I finally had an appreciation for what that means. But ultimately, I'll say, as a skeptic, my conclusion is that race does not exist. That human society imagines it exists, we treat it like it exists, we believe it exists, but it doesn't exist. The thing that people point to and call race or racial are those other things I mentioned earlier, right? It's ethnicity or it's culture, it's nationality, or it's racism masquerading as race. There's a way in which race language, especially the terms black and white, have been coded to be metaphors for racism itself. And in that way, there's a sort of camouflaging that happens so that race doesn't exist. The thing that exists to my mind is racism, and everything else is not connected to race. Like race doesn't determine culture. If it did, then people racialized in particular groups wouldn't have countless cultures as part of it. If race was determining culture, then we would have the same culture if we're in the same so-called racial group. We don't even speak the same language if we're in the same racial group. And genetically speaking, people on the continent of Africa are proven to be more genetically different from each other than they are compared to anyone else in the entire world. And we already know that human DNA is the differences between us is already minute to begin with. So even those differences aren't super significant, but it's significant in the sense of disproving the claim that there's some overarching race thing happening when there's not. It's not biological. Shannon, if that doesn't give you a clear idea of what skepticism is, I'm happy to take a second stab at it. Just let me know in the chat box. Yeah, so I'm actually gonna, if you email me at the email that Lakeisha just put in the chat box, I'll send you a copy of the script that I'm reading from and also the slides. I'm happy to share that. And also, you'll get a bonus. I have a PDF of the book Racecraft, The Soul of Inequality in American Life by Barbara and Karen Fields. I've had a lot of people tell me that that was a really pivotal book for them. So I'm happy to send that via email as well. Just reach out to me. Yeah, Sandra, thank you for that question. So the word philosophy itself, it's I think most people, at least me when I was younger, I viewed it as a sort of highfalutin thing. I thought of like Plato and Socrates and Aristotle, the classics, right? um, but importantly, philosophy is everywhere. It's all around us. It's a huge part of how we think and how we see ourselves and how we see the world. But we just don't call those ideas about ourselves or the world philosophy most of the time. So, what's happening now in the DEI space, that people are driving toward anti racism, in a sense, that is a philosophical effort, because it's asking people to participate in certain philosophies of race, which extend into a philosophy of anti-racism with the ultimate hope of undoing or lessening the harm of said racism. So it doesn't require much to actually change the landscape of how we currently or traditionally are practicing anti-racism to actually have the effect that we want to achieve. Because the one thing that seems to go unnoticed or unquestioned is the fact that we know, based on studies, that unconscious bias trainings, how we've been doing them, have been insufficient and ineffective. And we know from psychologists that the primary reason why they are ineffective is because whether you're dealing with race, whether you're dealing with gender, whether you're dealing with religion, whatever the category, the training itself often upholds the beliefs of the participants. So if I'm a participant and I believe in the idea of race, which most people do because we're taught to in American society, then in the unconscious bias training, I'm told about my ideas of race. I'm asked to question whether or not I'm carrying a hierarchy along with it. And then I'm told, generally speaking, how to better deal with or cope with the biases that we all have based on this idea of race. And it doesn't require a shift or a change in a person's beliefs, which is why it's ineffective. It can work short term, but it doesn't have any long term change on how a person sees themselves or how they see other people in terms of the social or cultural hierarchy. What we do is we teach the philosophies of race. If we're doing an anti-racist fill in the blank, we teach the philosophies of race and we invite people to participate in that space from a skeptical position, meaning they are raceless. We describe what that can look like. We describe our reasoning why, sort of in the way that I just did through the presentation. Like, this is the reason why I do a skeptical eliminativist framework. And we invite people to view themselves outside of racism. And I've been met with virtually no resistance in terms of what it takes to emotionally and intellectually commit to imagining oneself outside of racism. And the feedback that I've gotten from my students and people that I work with through my business, I also have a podcast. The feedback I get is literally off the charts. People find it extremely liberatory and extremely generative, and they're able to step outside of race, step outside of the black and white, pun intended, to re-examine themselves and to re-examine their peers and to re-examine the world, um, and to see the problem of racism that much more clearly, which then has the positive effect of helping us solve the problem more efficiently too, because right now part of the problem is we're misnaming it. Oh, Victoria, yes. Thank you for asking that question. What challenges or arguments do I hear when trying to explain to someone that race is racism in disguise? I think that the hardest part of this process for any person, myself included, it took me a solid 3 years working on my PhD to finally have a breakthrough moment. But I also didn't have anyone who was like holding my hand, teaching me the things, right? I was discovering it on my own. Um, the hardest part for most people is going to be separating race from culture and race from ethnicity. Now, ethnicity includes culture, it includes language, it includes religion, it includes DNA, it includes biology. It explains some of the phenotypical differences that we see amongst ourselves, right? Um, and in the United States, we're taught as if it's all the same. We're taught as if race determines our cultural inclinations. We're taught as if race um, is a direct reflection of what our ethnicity is, as if there are only five ethnicities, as there are only five race categories. Um, so the hardest part is helping people understand that when we're talking about thinking of ourselves as raceless, and when we're talking about moving toward a society which lives up to that truth, um, you have to help people recognize how the things that they are assigning to their race category are these other things. It's cultural, it's ethnic, or it is racism masquerading itself. And I think the easiest part is the racism masquerading as race. I think that's the easiest part for people to understand and hold on to and agree. And the harder part is getting them to disentangle race from actual meaningful things, right? Like culture is very meaningful for all of us, I think. And then I'll say, in terms of other challenges or arguments, I might get um, some people default to, um, well, even with the elimination of racism, then there's still going to be other hierarchies. We're just going to find something else to replace race with, to subjugate and oppress people. Some people try to default to that assertion, which is, I mean, take it for what you will, but I don't see it as a valid counter argument or a reason why we should hold on to racism. This idea that because other hierarchies are going to continue to exist, I think if we can get rid of one hierarchy or get the statistical majority across that threshold, that would be a wholly positive thing for human beings in American society. Um, Part of the thing that helps with this process too is like examining other countries and how race and racism work in the other countries. I speak with a lot of people from the continent of Africa, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Eritrea, also from the Caribbean, places like Jamaica. And you can find a lot of podcasts on YouTube actually of people talking about this very thing, where the people, Africans coming from the continent or coming from the Caribbean, talk about how they view themselves as raceless. Even if they apply the word black to themselves, the word black for them is a more matter of fact, it's a descriptor. It's not all of the other things that people attach to it in the US. And then when they come to places like the US, they are thrust into a racialist society, and they're basically forced to accept blackness or to choose blackness in a way that they never identified in the first place, and that in a way in which they disagree. So there are a lot of podcasts that you can search for people talking about this very question and this very problem. I mention it because help it can help us see how, although racism operates how it does in the US right now, it doesn't operate like that everywhere. Big R race doesn't travel everywhere, thereby, racism doesn't travel everywhere. And we should feel heartened by that fact, because then that means it doesn't have to exist and persist in the ways that it does here. While I look at the other questions, I want to share a link to a worksheet that I did for today's workshop. This is something for you to take with you, save it to your computer, and fill it out afterward. Yes, Sally. So if you email me at the email that Lakeisha is going to share again in the chat box, I'm happy to share the book Racecraft with you. I can also share the slides and the script to my PowerPoint today. I have a book forthcoming. It's being published by Palgrave Macmillan. I'm expecting it to hit the press early next year. So that'll be something to look forward to. The book is called Decolonizing Racialist Imaginations. And I go over very extensively the philosophies of race, the history, tracking it, all of that. And I've done a lot of the research for you, as you'll see by the very extensive bibliography. But importantly, in that book, I also give a 3-part solution for how we stop doing that, how we stop upholding racism unintentionally. Aaron, I feel that. Oh, so Aaron asks a tough question. They write, I've been encouraged by anti-racism mentors to name my whiteness and name their preferred identities, Black, Latinx, as part of my work. Can I do that and also support racelessness, and how? So I think the biggest thing to keep in mind, while most skeptics are going to be eliminativists, constructionists can also be eliminativists. My mentor is a constructionist eliminativist, and he says that it's possible for people to work within the category while seeking its destruction at the same time. Now, he's consistently on the journey to figuring out how to best do that. How do you work within a category without unintentionally upholding the category if you're seeking its destruction? I would say take note of a couple strategies. So, one thing that is absent from the US in general is signifying the social constructed nature of the thing, right? Like with race, because we conflate it with all these other meaningful things, and because we use the language that we use, we are unintentionally naturalizing its existence. So, one strategy I've used when I find myself having to use race, what I call race language, like Black, white, Asian, etc., I'll put racialized Black or I'll put racialized white to signify that there's an action, there's the practice of racism that is doing the work, the racialization. And in that way, I avoid unintentionally upholding it. I also say things like so-called, I'll say like so-called white person. Um, and in writing, I use quotation marks around the terms if I do use them. But probably racialized Black person or racialized white person, racialized Asian person. That's how I would generally go about it, because then you're working within the category while also complicating or troubling the category, if you will. So those are just a couple strategies you can put in your pocket and take with you. I do not align with this idea of naming one's whiteness, and all of that. I think that it's one thing to value and honor and appreciate the fact that people don't know that there are alternatives. And so they racialize themselves in particular ways. And that means something different for every person. Yes, check the box. That's true. Race matters to most people, especially people negatively impacted by by racism, right? Um, but I have a hard time seeing how naming one's whiteness or racializing oneself is in any way, shape, or form getting us closer to the solution, especially because racialized white people are not all the same, just as racialized Black people are not monolithic. And so I don't know. I just think, I think very well intentioned, uh, but in terms of actually solving any problem associated with racism, it's not doing that. It's, if anything, it's solidifying it. It's codifying what whiteness is. It's solidifying and teaching the hierarchy in ways that are easy to miss. And so I encourage my students to think about that and to think about the assertions that they made. Like one student made in my class at the start of the semester, they said something to the effect of, and what I'm saying as a white person is by no means like it doesn't trump anything you have to say as racialized Black students. They said Black students, just Black students. And I was like, I know that this is the new norm and that this is under the guise of liberalism and resistance and progress, but it feels, with everything I know, it feels very icky to me. I didn't like it. First of all, it's infantilizing racialized Black people. You know, it's like, why are you coddling me? Why are you coddling them? They don't need your apology. What she said was not controversial or anything. It was just like a regular statement that a student would say in a class. It didn't, the context was off, but just because she was responding to racialized Black students, they threw her whiteness on the table. And I was like, it's not solving the problem. I promise you, it's not solving the problem. Sky asks, how do you navigate the challenge of identifying ourselves in our own terms in light of the very material impacts of racism? Mm-hmm. For instance, I may identify however I'd like, but that doesn't change the material impacts of racism. Sky, so this type of question comes up a lot. There are two ways that we are racialized. We're racialized by society, right? And then we racialize ourselves. And the tendency, because we are really taught in the West to think in black and white terms, pun intended, the tendency is to hyper focus only on the individual or hyper focus only on the community, with little regard for the fact that both exist simultaneously and both have power and both have agency. And there is no community without the individual, right? A lot of individuals, there's no community. And so how I racialize myself is my own act of freedom and resistance. And I rebuke the idea that I must put myself in the category of racism to do it for any reason. There's no reason why I should be limiting myself to that category that racism created for me. Now, society's going to do what it will. Many people are going to look at me and they're going to racialize me as a Black woman, right? Or a Black person. And that's fine, because I recognize the fact that most people believe in the idea of race. And so how society does the thing to me, that's fine. But I have the power and the agency within myself to name myself and to amplify my voice, share my ideas, question everything, interrogate everything, and spread information and knowledge that shouldn't be devalued or diminished simply because I'm an individual working against a larger society who's going against what I'm doing for myself, if that makes sense. And so both things can happen at once. Both things being, I can identify myself as raceless. I'm a person, I'm a human being. I'm Sheena. I'm all the things that I am. And society will do what it will. But who in society has the authority or the right to look me in my eyes and tell me that I'm not what I say I am? And this question of what I would call systemic racism, mass incarceration, the opportunity gap, the different ways in which we can talk about the problem of racism and how it manifests itself, right? Part of the problem of racialist identity is the fact that the problems that we can point to and say what started this is our practice of racism in this country get obscured by our obsession with race. So it's very ironic because in a lot of ways we're obsessed with race and color, so we put it everywhere trying to solve the problem of racism, including like affirmative action, right? We try to put it everywhere to solve the problem, but studies show that just like unconscious bias training doesn't work to undo the biases that we teach people by teaching them race in the first place, affirmative action isn't as effective as one would think because it has primarily helped middle to upper class individuals who check the box of race. So the question of systemic racism and mass incarceration, we're talking about a specific portion of racialized Black and Brown communities, because not all racialized Black and Brown people are poor, and not all poor people are racialized Black and Brown people. And so when we talk about systemic racism, we're talking about a small portion of society, and we're talking about how it disproportionately might affect racialized, particular racialized groups. But because we're hyper focused on the question of race, we miss opportunities to solve the problem, because the problems we're putting out there then focus on race, which allows racism to persist, because the people who benefit from those policies that we've come up with so far anyway are middle class and upper class people who are not the same people being incarcerated on a mass level, right? So when we free ourselves from racialist ideology, it does empower us to see the problem of racism more clearly, to see how the media perpetuates certain ideas about race that would have us believe that things are, you know, teetering on civil war in a sense. But if we take a step back and do our own research, we come to find that we have not only made significant progress, but we will continue to make significant progress, and we can make more progress if we let go of race ideology and identify how that is continuing the problem. Anyone else who has questions for me, please feel free to email me. My email is in the chat box a little ways up. It's Sheena at theoryofracelessness.com. I'm happy to send my PowerPoint and the book Racecraft to you. I also want to share with you my podcast. There's a link to that in the chat box. So on my podcast, it's called Free Your Mind, and I talk with people from around the world about this particular topic. So if you're interested in learning more, definitely find me on YouTube, comment, let me know that you're there, and also feel free to email me with any questions. The last thing I would ask of you is to type in the chat box for me, where do you see yourself philosophically now? If we each have two philosophical positions, where do you see yourself? You're a naturalist. I'm going to type them in the chat box too, just as a refresher. A constructionist or a skeptic. And then what do you think should be done with race? Are you a conservationist, an eliminativist, or a reconstructionist? I'd love to hear from you. And if you feel like there's a philosophy of race that you want to explore more, please let me know that as well. Yeah. I will say too, while folks are thinking about their responses, there's an entire movement of people who are, pushing toward this, what's called the abolition of race. So I'm not the only voice out here trying to help society to the other side of this thing. Thank you, Velasquez. Thank you, Shannon. Yeah, Lori, I promise you, I had no idea what being a skeptic was until I found myself there. Yeah, so Reconstructionist, Sarah, the word race has been under Reconstruction since its inception, and so any way in which we are actively working to reconstruct what race means, hashtag Black excellence, Black is beautiful, Black Lives Matter. Those are all explicit efforts to reconstruct race. And constructionists believe that race is it might not be biologically real, but it's real in other ways. Thank you so much for chiming in, y'all. Thank you for your engagement. Thank you for coming today. Please find me on the other side. I'm here. Find me on YouTube, email me. I'm happy to continue the conversation. I'm committing my life to doing this work, hoping for a time when I don't have a job. Be well. Take care. Thank you.